Chapter 4, Part 3. So in this last section of the chapter, they discuss evolution and behavior. So we're going to cover the three sections: adaptive mechanisms, evolution and human nature, and then talk a little bit about evolutionary psychology. So let's consider first what is evolutionary psychology. Okay. So evolutionary psychology seeks to understand how behavioral abilities and tendencies have evolved over the course of millions of years in response to environmental demands. So it's based on Darwin's theory of evolution, which was 1859. And what Darwin argued is that patterns of behavior have evolved through natural selection the same way physical characteristics have. The biological purpose of life is to procreate, right? If we don't procreate, then our genes and our species dies out. So therefore, we have evolved in ways to behave in ways that help our survival, right? So evolutionary psychology, it's about survival of the fittest. What attributes, what characteristics, what behaviors um, have been passed on because it allows us to best adapt to our environment and therefore ensure procreation. Evolutionary psychology is rooted in evolutionary biology and Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin's theory of natural selection was first put forth in his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, which is, by the way, available in the library. I read it for my fourth year psychology thesis paper and wrote a paper on it. It's actually a pretty amazing book. It is there. I suggest if you're interested in this, go take it out and take a look at it. Anyways, we're going to get more into his theory of natural selection in the next slide. So next, the text looks into evolution of adaptive mechanisms. Okay, a little bit of review here. So evolution is the change over time in the frequency with which genes occur. Right, mutation of these genes that's passed on. The random events, accidents in gene reproduction, but that's what creates variation within species. Natural selection is differential survival of and reproduction of living things due to differences in phenotype, which we talked about. So phenotype, if you remember, is the expression, what it looks like, right? Blonde hair, brown hair, long neck, short neck. Natural selection is the natural process by which organisms better adapted to their environment survive and reproduce, and organisms that are less able to adapt to their environment do not survive. Again, variation, mutation in the genes creates individuals with traits that are better suited to their environment. And these mutated genes that create the better ability to adapt get passed on from generation to generation. It's important to note that when Darwin was putting out his theories, he knew nothing of genes at the time, right? That was 1859. So his big contribution was specifying the process by which species change over time in response to environmental demands. The three principles of natural selection: 1, most characteristics are inherited. 2, more offspring are produced than are able to survive. And 3, offspring with more favorable characteristics will survive and have more offspring than those individuals with less favorable traits. Evolutionary adaptations with regards to humans is then just talked about in the text. And what they're talking about there is that apes, monkeys, whatnot, originally living in trees, right? Reduction in vegetation forced apes to the land to hunt for food, right? So now that they're on the ground hunting for food, they became bipedal. Um, they had to basically free up their hands to use tools. Then they started hunting in groups, and the hunting in groups encouraged socialized behavior, right? So with the evolution of socialized behavior, became social roles started to evolve, right? So within a group of hunters, you're going to have the hunter, you're going to have the the protector. You need to have someone back nurturing the children. Um, Also, the development of language was encouraged by this, social communication, and the transmission of knowledge. So there was just some examples discussed in the text of how changes in adapting to the environment forced humans to evolve in certain ways and develop, different communications, languages, and behaviors. So, just as adaptation to our environment has resulted in the development of different characteristics and behaviors, it's also resulted in the loss of some, say, parts of our bodies and behaviors. And so, I found a video here that sort of shows some of the things that have changed over time.
Your body is a temple, but it's also a museum of natural history. Look closely and you'll see parts that aren't there because you need them, but because your animal ancestors did. No longer serving their previous function, but not costly enough to have disappeared. These remnants of our deep history only make sense within the framework of evolution by natural selection. With your arm on a flat surface, push your thumb against your pinky and tip your hand slightly up. If you see a raised band in the middle of your wrist, you've got a vestigial muscle in your forearm. That tendon you see connects to the palmaris longus, a muscle that around 10 to 15% of people are missing on one or both of their arms. It doesn't make them any weaker though. There's no difference in grip strength. In fact, it's one of the first tendons that surgeons will take out so that they can use it in reconstructive and cosmetic surgeries. You can find the palmaris longus across mammal species, but it's most developed among those that use their forelimbs to move around. In primates, that means the muscle is longer in lemurs and monkeys and shorter in chimps, gorillas, and other apes that don't do a lot of scrambling through trees. It's not the only leftover muscle that we've got. Look at the three that are attached to our outer ear. We can't get much movement out of these muscles, especially compared to some of our mammal relatives who use them to locate the sources of sounds. Presumably, this would have been quite helpful for early nocturnal mammals. In humans, you can still detect the remnants of this adaptation with electrodes. In one study, researchers recorded a spike of activity in the ear muscle cells in response to a sudden sound. Not enough to move the ear, but detectable. And you can probably guess the location of the sound based on these results. It came from a speaker placed to the left of the study subjects. So this is their left ear subconsciously trying and failing to pivot toward the sound. You can see another futile effort by our vestigial body parts when you get goosebumps. When we're cold, tiny muscles attached to our body hairs contract, pulling the hair upright, which causes the surrounding skin to form a bump. For our furry mammal relatives, the raised hair increases the amount of space for insulation, helping them stay warm. Birds can do this too. You've probably seen a puffy pigeon on a cold day. Adrenaline is one of the hormones involved in the body's response to cold temperatures, and it's also part of the fight or flight response. So it helps some animals appear larger when they're threatened. And it may be why surprising and emotional turns in music can give some people goosebumps. And then there's our tail. At the end of our spine are a set of fused vertebrae. Some people have 3, some people have 5. We call it the tailbone. It now serves as an anchor for some pelvic muscles, but it's also what's left of our ancestors' tails. Every one of us actually had a tail at one point when the basic body plan is being laid out at around 4 weeks of gestation. Human embryos closely resemble embryos of other vertebrates, and that includes a tail with 10 to 12 developing vertebrae. In many other animals, it continues to develop into a proper tail, but in humans and other apes, the cells in the tail are programmed to die a few weeks after they appear. Very rarely, though, a mutation allows the ancestral blueprint to prevail, and a human baby will be born with a true vestigial tail. The most adorable...
Lastly, let's look at the human brain and how that's evolved over time. So the greatest growth in the human brain has occurred in those areas concerned with the higher mental processes, right? Particularly attention, memory, thought, and language. Most of the human brain, the growth and development of new areas occurred as an adaptation to climate change, right? So larger, more complex brains enabled human brains in this time period to interact with each other and with their surroundings and their new different ways of survival. In the 1960s, a neuroscientist named Paul MacLean, he formulated the triune brain model, which is based on the division of the human brain into three distinct regions, right? So his propositions are based on evolutionary view of the brain development and said there's three regions of the brain. So the first region, which is the basal ganglia region, is the primal brain, right? And that was reptilian, also called reptilian brain, which is responsible for all of our instinctive responses. And then from that developed the limbic system or the emotional brain. Okay, that is concerned with language of emotions, feelings, emotional experience, implicit memory. And then finally, at the top of the hierarchy is the the neofrontal cortex, right, or the rational brain. Um, and this is responsible for intellectual and executive functioning, verbal language, conscious thought, and self-awareness. So this hierarchical organization of the brain, it sort of demonstrates the gradual acquisition of different brain structures um, through adaptation to the environment, right? So again, the basal ganglia was acquired first, followed by the limbic system, which is in charge of our emotions, and then finally the neocortex, which is responsible for the rational and objective thoughts. So they say the essence of human nature is the adaptations that have evolved through natural selection, right? So behavioral adaptations to the environment. And what they've discovered is that there are many behaviors and characteristics that are consistent and common across all cultures, right? So this sort of supports that. For example, common aspects of human behavior, the innate ability to acquire language. All humans across all cultures have this innate ability, starting very, very early, to acquire any language that they're introduced to. Newborns pre-wired to specific stimuli. Human faces, for example. There's studies done where you put different objects in front of a newborn, you get very little reaction. But when you put a human face in front of a baby, then there's this intense reaction, right? Also, discriminating odors. Newborns can detect or smell who their mother is very quickly. At 1 week of age, show primitive mathematical skills, meaning that they know the difference between less than and greater than, right? An innate need to belong. Now, this one you'll see a lot in psychology in many different areas. It's one of humans' greatest desires and needs. Um, we're very social animals, right? And we need to have a feeling of belongingness. Altruism. Altruism is about helping others. Humans seem to have this innate sort of need to help, especially when it comes to their relatives. So studies have showed that while people will help others that they don't know, they're more likely to help relatives and even more likely to help as blood relatives get closer. So I'm going to show the most altruistic behavior towards my children and my sister and my mother versus say like a cousin or a distant other relative. Universal emotions of happiness and goodwill, and also the enhanced ability to learn and solve problems. The last section is evolutionary psychology. So, evolutionary psychologists, they think about behaviors in terms of their functions, right? Everything is about function, how those functions contribute to the success and adaptation of an individual. So, of the many discussed in the chapter, we're going to take a look at personality, mating systems, and parental interest and mate preference. So, one reason that humans have been so successful is that they're highly adaptive social creatures, right? Very wide range of personality characteristics. Now, we talked about the five factor model of personality in a previous chapter. What research has found is that this five factor model works across all cultures. It's their universal traits across the world, and evolutionary psychologists would look at why. I mean, why would all cultures across the world have similar personality traits? And they would argue that those traits, those five traits on the continuum, of course, helped humans physically survive and reproduce. That would be the reason. So the text looks a little bit at maybe what the questions would be, right? So extroversion and introversion. Remember, all these things are on a continuum. I simplified it here just to simplify the slide. So extroversion and introversion. So the reason that those personality characteristics would be important is because from a survival point, the question is like, can I dominate this person, right? You need to kind of consider whether they're an introvert or an extrovert in making that decision. Same with agreeableness. You have to think, is this person friendly or hostile? Openness, how smart is this person? How smart is X? How open are they able to problem solve is where that's going from. Conscientiousness, can I trust them, right? Is this someone that I can trust, or is this somebody who's going to stab me in the back and, maybe kill me later? Neuroticism is X. Is this person sane or are they unstable, right? So throughout our development, these are questions like back from cave person's day, that we've had to ask these questions and assess people and assess these personality traits in order to make reasonable decisions on how to behave. So before we get into parental investment theory, I wanted to sort of switch this and talk about mating systems. Because it's important to know these terms, so when we go to talk about the theory, that it makes sense. So monogamy, humans generally, two parents having equal parental investment, right? So a monogamous system is expected if it's unlikely that a single parent can successfully raise the offspring. So birds, presumably humans, are supposed to, they need each other to raise their children in a successful way. Polyandry, one female married to many males. Okay, so this is still practiced in Tibet. I looked it up. Tibet and Marquesas Islands, South Pacific. It's also still legal in Nepal, which is interesting. Polygyny, both males and females have many mating partners. Okay. The reason this is beneficial is first of all, many mating partners during the breeding season, right? It's something that you see in many animal species which have their breeding seasons, right? So why this is beneficial for females, it ensures that they get a fertilized egg, and why it's beneficial for males, they can increase their reproductive success by fertilizing as many eggs as possible. Okay, and then the last is polygamy, where you have one male married to many females. And one example of that are elephant seals. So some animals also some animals are engaged in polygamy for the advantage of their species. So with elephant seals, the male is able to fertilize as many female concealed as possible, and then the females have protection from this male. So, what's parental investment theory? Parental investment is the time, effort, energy, risk, everything associated with caring successfully for each of the offspring. And parental investment theory uses sex differences in parental investment to explain the different mating systems that we just talked about. What are some of the strategies that have evolved to ensure survival of offspring? The connection between parental investment and mating systems. So, for example, with elephants and with humans or whatnot, there's a great deal of parental investment going into our offspring. We spend, months and months and months pregnant and years raising. So we tend to have 1, 2, or 3, whatnot, offspring, right? So large parental investment typically equals fewer offspring because your time and your energy, all of your parental investment goes into 1, 2, or 3 children, right? But in the case, say, of sea turtles, as you see down there, very little parental investment at all, right? They have the babies and they're kind of on their own. So they'll lay hundreds of eggs, and the turtles are sort of on their own. And a small portion of them survive. Just as there's gender differences in parental investment, there's also gender differences in mate selection. There was a study done where men and women from 37 countries were surveyed and rated characteristics for their ideal mate on a 4-point Likert scale. So there were over 10,000 participants in the study, and what they found was men overall valued physical attractiveness of a mate more important than women. Men preferred younger women. Men indicated that the ideal age for a woman to marry is 24, and for men it's 27. And women indicated that the ideal age for men to marry is 28. And for the ideal age for women is 25. In 36 out of the 37 cultures, women valued a mate's earning potential more than men did. The results of this study demonstrate evidence of cross-cultural consistency in gender differences in mate preferences, right? So women and men follow different biologically based mating strategies, and much of that has to do with what characteristics are going to ensure reproductive success, right? So, for example, women place greater value than men on on their earning potential, and that's because they need resources, right, to be supported and such, so that they can focus on raising the children, right? Men prefer younger women because younger women presumably have greater reproductive capacity, right? Men value signs of physical health and fertility and attractiveness more than women do. As I stated earlier, the biological purpose of life is to procreate. If we don't procreate, our genes in our species die out, and so therefore we've evolved to behave in ways that help our survival, to be attracted to certain characteristics that are going to give us the greatest success in producing offspring. Okay, well, that completes our section, our part 3 on evolution and behavior. I hope you've enjoyed this. This is one of my favorite areas. Anyways, we will see you in chapter 5.